It's time for the Tactics Meeting. Episode 16, Crisis Messaging, with Sam Sacco from Strategy Communications. In this episode, we'll be talking about the purpose of public messaging, becoming a trusted source of information, the news cycle in the digital age, and much, much more, so stick around. If you like podcasts and you're interested in safety, I invite you to try Spot on Safety, hosted by myself, Dan Smiley, and my co-host, Amy Does from iWorkWise. We talk about slips, trips, and falls, confined space entry, HAZWOPER, you name it. If it falls under OSHA and safety, we talk about it. It's available on Apple Podcasts. Now let's get to this amazing episode.
Sam Sacco, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Dan. Great to be here.
So, Sam, before we start off in what is your topic of expertise, crisis communication, can you start by telling us how you got into crisis communication for oil spill response in the first place? A lot of people have a kind of a pivot story for how they went from doing one thing to being in this oil spill crisis communication world.
And I do have that pivot story, Dan. It's like harkens back to the late 80s and early 90s. Obviously, I think everyone remembers the Exxon Valdez incident. I was not involved in that incident.
Me either.
However, the first major spill response to occur after the Exxon Valdez incident, I was involved. And that was a BP response off of the coast of Huntington Beach, California, called the American Trader incident. And we were brought in to assist BP, and we helped BP. And at that time, there wasn't what we all know now of as unified command. That was still in its morphing stages. Legislation had been passed, the OPA Act of 1990, OPA 90, and yet it hadn't been fully implemented. So we were kind of in this middle ground area to where we represented BP, but we did have a very close working relationship with both the U.S. Coast Guard and the state of California, which at that time was California Fish and Game. And so we did work together, we coordinated together, but we did not come together in one command post. And I only bring that up because so much has changed since those days. But that pivot, that moment when we did go to work for BP, was my very first oil spill response, and it changed my life. I began to see that there was a whole niche area, a whole area separated out there from the rest of the public affairs world that focused on oil spill response. And so that's kind of my little story of how I got from being a general public affairs practitioner to an oil spill communications response specialist.
So how would you describe that earlier part of your career in the general communications sphere?
I would say it was exciting times because while we were responding and we all took it seriously, we were also kind of inventing a lot of the things that are going on today. And so from a communication standpoint, some of the things we were doing were kind of being tried for the first time, but hadn't become part of the regular practice like some of the things that we do now are. And giving examples of how we talked very much about the cooperation and teaming strategy that was underway, even though there really wasn't this thing called unified command yet. We knew that teaming message was a very important message, that it couldn't be just BP by itself out there responding, that people needed to understand there was a team of people that included agencies that they knew and trusted, like the U.S. Coast Guard, like the California Department of Fish and Game, like NOAA, et cetera, et cetera. And so again, that became very important in the way we approach things. And of course, being able to articulate what it was we were doing operationally and communicate that to the world also was very important. That's not to say we invented that, but we understood its importance. That in order to get credit for a job well done, you needed to explain what it was you were doing. Otherwise, no matter how good your operational response was, it would go by the wayside because people would assume nothing was being done. So again, that was some of the key things that were happening back then. And again, just a great working relationship too with both the U.S. Coast Guard and the state of California on that particular incident.
Well, Sam, you've spoken to this a little bit already, but can you tell us about crisis communication and its importance in the emergency response process?
Yeah, and I'm going to kind of go back to what I already mentioned because it is just so important. To me, there are two critical elements to effective emergency response, and of course, one of those components is the operational side of it. You have to mount a legitimate, viable operational response. If you don't, you'll be dead in the water. No matter how good your communications are, if you're not doing anything to truly respond, you will be found out, and you will never get credit for doing the right thing. But secondly, and I mentioned this before, you have to have a good communications component to your emergency response operation in order to get credit for doing the job. And I give some examples like key objectives that drive the operational response, such as safety of people, safety of responders, and other key objectives like minimizing any long-term damage to the environment. These are all important things, and they're driving the operational response. Well, people need to understand that, and that's where the communications component comes in. How are you doing that? How are you protecting the safety of people? How are you minimizing long-term damage to the environment? What steps are you taking to stop the leak of the product into the water? These are important objectives, and those objectives need to be communicated back to the general public and other key stakeholders such as media, elected officials, etc., so that people know that the steps that need to be taken are being taken.
Yes, and we've seen really aggressive, well-coordinated, effective operational responses become a complete failure in the eyes of the public, in the eyes of regulators, in the eyes of politicians, because the responsible party failed to tell a compelling story about their success. So would you say that that is a key component then of crisis communication? To get out and telling that story of how we are effectively responding.
Yeah, it's critical. It's critical to overall success. And this is certainly not to pick on any particular company, but of course, it's a historic case study, the Exxon Valdez incident. You know, a lot of people don't know this, but it was one of the most spectacular oil spill responses in the history of the world. What Exxon did in Alaska was incredible in the way they organized, in the way they put together an operational response, in the way they created new tools that were used to help clean up and protect oil impact parts of the environment. But there were other factors at play back then, and we didn't have this thing called unified command. And there were some arguments between the company, between state officials, between the Coast Guard. And these arguments were being aired through the media publicly. So it looked like nothing was being done. It looked like entities were just arguing and disagreeing, when in fact the exact opposite was true. So a missed opportunity, yeah. And again, not Exxon's fault. It was just the nature of the beast at that time. And it's why it was imperative that when Congress did act to put together the Oil Pollution Act of 1990, that it created this thing called Unified Command, to where all of these entities, whether it was the company and the key agencies that are responsible for oversight, would work together. That doesn't mean Coast Guard's working for the company. It means they would work together on the response to come up with the best ideas, and also to eliminate these sidebar arguments, work these details out, and then focus on solution and communicate that to the public as it should be, so that people understood what was really happening operationally, and that message didn't get lost by the wayside.
Well, certainly Exxon Valdez has become synonymous in the eye of the public as a failure. So less a failure of response and more a failure of crisis communication.
Indeed, and again, it's the old if you were to give grades, and this goes for all the other entities that were involved in that very major response. If you were to give a grade on communications, the grade would be F. If you were to give a grade on operational response, the grade would be A. But guess which grade overrides the other? That communications grade needs to be just as high as the operational grade if you want to get credit for doing the job you were supposed to do in that very difficult situation.
So, Sam, you were putting together a crisis communication program for a client who just experienced an oil spill event. What would separate an effective program from an ineffective one? What road would you go down?
Well, I believe that it's imperative that you establish your communications operation as the primary source of information. This has to be the goal, and it must be achieved to be successful. And what do I mean by that? You need to be accessible. You need to be accessible to the media, to the general public, and other key stakeholders, be they other outside agencies or other elected officials, et cetera, et cetera. You need to be informative. What I mean by that is that you have to compile and distribute good, usable data that helps stakeholders to understand the steps you are taking to manage and to control the incident. Timeliness of that information is critical too. Your information must be relevant to the news cycle that you're in. Waiting until the next day to explain something important, like why a neighborhood was not evacuated, that's not good enough. You got to have that kind of information out now. Why was a neighborhood not evacuated? Who made those decisions? Were people's safety at stake? You can't mess around with that and wait 24 hours before you begin addressing it. People need to know that kind of information now. So again, timeliness of information is critical. And finally, you have to be responsive. And what I mean by that is that this isn't just about giving out information. It's also about identifying stakeholders who are having issues or major concerns and who need help in understanding what their pathways to solution are. You may not have their solution, but you may have the way that they can get to solution. So again, it goes beyond just numbers like how much boom have you put out or how many response workers are working. It's also identifying those who need help and how to get their issues and concerns resolved. If you can follow that approach, you're going to establish yourself as the primary source of credible information, and that's a powerful place to be. That means media, impacted residents, other stakeholders. They're going to start with you first to get their information. They're not going to be going to other sources who may have incorrect information, or other sources who may intentionally have an agenda against you and want to negatively affect your response. Again, establish your communications organization as the primary source of credible information.
Today, the news cycle is so much faster than it was when either one of us started in this business. I'm not even sure you could call it a cycle anymore. It's just a never-ending line, or an object traveling at light speed. What has changed for you in this world when you're dealing with the speed of information processing?
That's a good question. Obviously, social media is a whole new factor when it comes to emergency response, crisis communications, et cetera. You have to have a viable social media component. But the thing that I've seen that hangs up most responses is not having a social media component. Most do now. Not having good folks running their regular traditional media response. They're out there. What I see as the big problem nowadays is the approval process on information. It takes too long to approve obvious, important information that needs to get out, and we get lost in, and you're right, the news cycles now can be 5 minutes long because of social media, as opposed to 12 hours like they once were. But yeah, you've got to have an expedited approval process. And that means you have to have a very close working relationship between those who create and pull together the information, the public information operation or the liaison operation, and those who approve the information, the command section of a unified command. If that is not in sync, if it is taking too long to get obvious things approved, then you will not position yourself as the primary source of information. People will start going elsewhere. So again, we have to work on expediting that approval process and making it so that it fits into 2021. We still tend to be drilling and exercising like it's 1999, and that's not going to cut it in a real response.
Yeah, when I'm looking at news articles and I click on a new article on my phone, I mean, if it hasn't fully loaded in 5 seconds, I move on to the next one. I mean, I expect it to just, click along.
Yep.
The last big drill that I did, our PIO was very aggressive in coming quickly to the unified command right after the 201 brief, without even giving us really an opportunity to go into the initial UC meeting to say, what information that's out there can we in the Joint Information Center use to establish ourselves as the primary source of information? What can we say without your direct approval, and what needs to come back for unified command buy-off? And I thought that aggressive action early made all the difference in how the rest of the day went.
I would second that notion, and it's good that you had a good aggressive public information operation and public information officer who was pushing for that. One of the things, though, even with a good public information officer or liaison officer who is pushing command for timely approval of information, if those commanders have not been trained appropriately, that message will fall upon deaf ears. So how do we fix that problem? I am a big fan of doing joint training that is specialized between incident commanders, deputy incident commanders, and their public information and liaison team to work together in the training environment so that these kinds of issues can be worked out. Also, so that command begins to understand its importance in not only in approving timely information, but also its role in being the face of the response, of having a media role, of having a very critical stakeholder role. They are the face of the response. So therefore, it is imperative that they have a very close and good working relationship. Too often times in exercises nowadays, that relationship doesn't even start forming until the exercise begins. To me, that should be changed so that these people know each other and have kind of worked with each other in a training environment prior to an exercise.
Yeah, that's good advice. And I attended a couple of your classes where those groups of people worked together to establish those relationships, and it seemed to be pretty darn effective. So aside from that, do you have any other advice for those leading a crisis communication efforts?
Yeah, I think it's very important that if you're a communication specialist and you're in a difficult situation like a oil spill response, part of your role is that of being a manager of expectations and also an understand and have a great understanding of incident potential. And those sound like maybe a lofty technical speak, but let me explain. When I'm talking about expectation management, we can't be going around creating messages that are based on hope. As we all know, hope is not a strategy. And if messages based on hope are formulated on day one, it may sound really good. The problem is then there's a day two and a day three, and all those hope messages fall by the wayside, and you've now exacerbated your problems because you gave too much hope on day one to stuff that did not happen. So again, stay away from hope as a messaging strategy. You also have to be aware of not making promises that you can't keep. And I see this oftentimes in oil spill response when it comes to boom operations. We got 20,000 feet of boom out. We've got more boom out than has ever been seen in this geographical region. And then the natural follow-up question by stakeholders or media are, well, then can you keep the oil off the shoreline? And the answer is always, well, we've got 20,000 feet of boom out there and we're going to do everything we can to keep it off that shoreline. Well, the problem is, if that's the way you're going to approach it, you're now not managing expectations. There's a good chance that some of that oil, no matter how much boom you have out there, is going to make its way past that boom and hit that shoreline. Incident potential is going to be bigger. It's not just going to be on water cleanup. There is going to be shoreline impact. So I really try and press people on this time and time again. Don't make promises you can't keep. Talk in terms of the contingencies the way you have them planned. You have a booming strategy on water, and at the same time, you're also setting up a shoreline cleanup strategy just in the event that some of the oil does make its way to shore. Very simple. You can all be told on day one, but for some reason, people only want to focus on the boom they put out and forget about all the other steps that are being taken to protect the shoreline. So those are just a couple of things that I think people should look out for. And I would say the other thing too is just remember, bad news does not age well. And I've seen this happen time and time again. And I can give a great example in the Costco Busan incident, where the captain of the port, who was the federal on-scene coordinator, on day one said the amount of oil spilled was about 140 gallons. And he stuck to that messaging all through day one, despite the fact that later in the evening, it was made aware that this thing was as much as 50,000 gallons, 50,000 gallons of bunker sea oil that had flowed into San Francisco Bay. So instead of putting out that new information, that update information, the decision was made to wait until tomorrow to break the bad news. Well, the firestorm that occurred by holding up that news was tremendous. And the response paid a price for it. And ultimately, that captain of the port paid a price as well. And people can check the history on that. But again, don't hold off on bad news. If there's bad news, get it out there, explain what it is, and then explain how you're trying to solve the problem, despite the fact that the news isn't as good as we had hoped it would be earlier.
Well, Sam, speaking of spill volume, this is often an initial place where crisis communication goes off the rail. People want to speculate on how much was spilled. They're asked the question, well, how much oil has been spilled? And they want to give a number. But this, in my experience, is a mistake. How would you address that question in a crisis communication world? How much has been spilled?
Yeah, day one, there's a lot of information we don't know. We don't know what caused the incident on day one. We don't know. Sometimes we don't even know if oil is still being released, that is being investigated or assessed. And so on day one, very seldom will we ever know how much oil has been released. So what do? Well, one of the things I always encourage my clients to do is to make sure, one, you're in alignment with the U.S. Coast Guard. Because the last place you ever want to be is giving out one number and the Coast Guard giving out another number, or you giving out nothing and them giving out something. So how do we get in alignment? Well, that takes communications, and you've got to talk with the Coast Guard. There are reporting regulations where a company does need to call in to the Coast Guard and explain how much they think has been released. But all those factors, how do we work it? Well, on day one, here's one thing we do know. We have oil where it shouldn't be. We have oil that needs to be cleaned up. We have oil in the water, and that's a serious situation. Okay, there are times where we can't give a specific number because we don't know yet. But rather than just saying we don't know, let's talk in terms of how important is this to us. So how much oil is spilled? Right now, we don't know, but I can tell you this, we have oil where it shouldn't be. And it looks like it's a sizable amount. We're taking this very seriously. We've already notified the U.S. Coast Guard. We've notified the state environmental agency, and we're working together on going out and assessing not only how much oil has been released, but how best to get it corralled, boomed off, and recovered. And that's about the best we can do a lot of times on day one. Now, there are certain other areas where the Coast Guard will require some kind of a worst case. So if you have a tank that's been punctured, what is the maximum amount of oil that's in that tank? And let's say, just for numbers' sake, it's 80,000. Let's say it's 80,000 barrels of oil are in this punctured tank. Well, there are some areas where the Coast Guard will require you to say this has a maximum potential of being an 80,000 barrel spill. But in working with the Coast Guard, we can also work on that language and temper it and make it more accurate by saying it's an 80,000 barrel tank, but we do know the puncture was above the water line. So that means that only oil up to that point can be released. Exactly how much that is, I can't give you a number, but right now, what we're trying to do is get that leak fixed and move all the oil out of that tank into an empty tank. But in the meantime, we're going to continue to work with the Coast Guard until we can get an exact amount of oil that's been released. So again, it's day one is tough. You're not going to have all of the answers, but it's all in how we go about answering. So watch out for the yes or no, or hey, can you give us a number? No, I can't. Let's give some explanation of the process. And that's where the real answer on day one belongs.
Well, Sam, here's what I think is a harder question. One of the objectives of my last worst case drill was the process of approving application of aerial dispersants. And the question came up, what do we now say to the public? How do we address this in the media? Because we are going to start off really looking like the bad guy by putting this chemical into the water. If I came to you as my public information officer and said, Sam, we're looking at aerial dispersants, be ready to address this, what would you do? How would you go about that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I am actually surprised at how many times I've worked with companies who want to go out and own the dispersant issue or the in situ burning issue. Let's stick with dispersants for right now. Companies don't make that decision. If you're the Acme Oil Company and you want to use dispersants, you can propose that you use them, but that decision is made by what's called the Regional Response Team, which is made up of entities like the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, the U.S. Coast Guard, NOAA, key state environmental agencies, all of these different agencies who have high credibility, who do the analysis on whether or not dispersants are going to be allowed. They make the final decision on whether or not they can be used. So like I say, if I'm a company, I don't go out and say, we want to use dispersants and we're pushing to use them. I want to say that a recommendation has been made to the RRT to use dispersants, and that entity is made up, and I would name off those agencies, and then remind everybody that it is those agencies who will make the decision, not Acme Oil.
Well, that is really great advice. We were in the drill, got hung up on this idea of messaging, and it seems like there's an opportunity to have some pre-planning done around that kind of messaging. What would your thoughts be on that?
I encourage all of my clients that I work with to have that message ready to go. Now, does that mean it always shows up when we do exercises? No. Every now and then it does, but just have to go back and keep training people. And a lot of times it has to do with you have new incident commanders and new FOSCs, Federal Unseen Coordinators, who are doing this for a first time. So it's a new rodeo for them. But with some of the old hands, they know, they understand this. And again, there is no reason for a company to go out and put itself on a limb, when it in fact is not going to be the one that makes that decision. But I can tell you, I've been involved in major responses where I've seen exactly that happen. And I pushed back and tried to remind people that it's not your decision to make. This decision belongs to both the US government and those key agencies I've mentioned earlier, and whatever state is involved or states that are involved in the environmental aspects of that response.
Thank you for that. What do you think about the utility of the press conference in this day of high-speed news cycles? Does it have value? Do we keep doing them?
The short answer is yes. You still do them, but you certainly don't depend on them in between the 10 to 12 hour periods that you might be staging one. And I see this happen way too often in exercises and sometimes even in real events. Media call in, they want information. The response back to them is, well, Unified Command's going to have a press conference at 2 o'clock today. Well, it's 9 a.m. right now. That's 5 hours from now. Can you try and get me the information I'm looking for? No, you have to wait for the press conference. No, that is not the way it should be. A press conference to me serves its most important service is that it introduces the leadership face to face of the response, but it is not the way that media should have its questions answered during the rest of the operational period. It's not the way stakeholders should have their information answered the rest of the operational cycle. We can't wait for press conferences in this day and age. Social media is a critical, vital tool. We need to be better at using social media to address some of these informational requests that come in earlier. We need to be better at moving that approval process so that basic information like, can we use the top 3 objectives as message points, gets quickly approved. It doesn't go through some big, long bureaucratic process between PIO and command before you can go out and say, yes, safety of people is our #1 priority, or minimizing impact to the environment is a critical factor and part of our response. These are things that we should be able to say within 5 minutes after a response, if not 5 seconds.
Yeah, I did a drill last year here during the COVID world where we had put some effort into having a social media simulation as part of the drill and did some training to make sure that the PIOs and the incident commanders knew how the simulation was going to work and mirrored it as closely as we could on Twitter. And we had some initial posts already set up in it before the drill began, and the responsible party, the Unified Command, was not able to agree or even put up one post in reply to inquiries throughout the entire drill. Not one. The drill lasted 7 hours.
Yeah, no, and it's just really crazy. Part of the communication strategy in this day and age is not to have all the answers, but to be part of the conversation. And if you're not part of the conversation, you will then be ignored. And that thing I talked about earlier, that establishing yourself as the primary source of credible information, you will fall by the wayside if you're not part of the social media conversation. That doesn't mean you're reacting and responding to every wacko who's posting something, but it is looking at social media strategically and saying, what conversations are important? Who's participating in these conversations? And do we need not only to monitor this conversation, but do we need to be a part of that conversation? And if so, do we also need to have some dialogue with particular people who are in that conversation, not necessarily on the big social media platform, but through direct messaging or through pick up the good old fashioned telephone and call them. These are decisions that need to be made. But lo and behold, I agree with you, Dan. I see too often that it's hours and hours before the social media function gets the green light to stop just monitoring, but also become proactive. And that's just too long. It's too long.
My last large response, we called our contracted PIO within the first 20 minutes of the response. And it was midnight, and she didn't leave home or come to a command post, but she got on the phone and she called the Coast Guard's PIO. She called the state. She fired up social media to see what was being posted. And we never really had to engage in those early hours directly, but we made sure that the posts that went out from the Coast Guard and from the state had some input and were coordinated. And I thought that was just so successful. How early in the process do you recommend involving the public information officer?
At the outset, I think it's probably another failing that occurs too often in the call out. Some companies are very good at it. Some companies, in their initial internal notifications, the PIO and those who may fill what's called the liaison office are in that initial notification, and that to me is critical. But I've also worked with other companies and clients in the past to where I was their first call, and we're already 12 hours into this thing. So it's kind of like, no, the strategy has to be, I mean, I work with some of my clients. I represent some of my clients to media and stakeholders. That's because I've worked with them for years and years, and I'm kind of part of the family. But they are also aware, because I've worked with them over the years, to know that they have to have trained people ready to go who fill that PIO role long before they ever even talk to me. They can't make it so I'm their first contact. They need to have locals within their operations who can fill that gap, so that someone like me who comes in later is morphing into something that's already been established, as opposed to something that's, like I say, 12 hours old and nobody's done anything. So yeah, I would say you want to have it as a first call, and also you want to make sure you have many people trained who can fill that slot. And again, the way I've worked with clients over the years, operations people are trained to be initial PIOs. They can fill that gap. And they actually, some of them make great PIOs. As a matter of fact, we bring them over with us once we get fully established. So because they understand the technical aspects, but they also have that ability to explain it if they've gone through good training. So again, yeah, very important. Have your PIO and your liaison people, the people who reach out to the outside world, on that initial call list.
What is the relationship between the PIO and the liaison officer? We often see people wanting to co-locate them in the same room or almost merge them together, but they fill a similar yet separate role. How do you go about working with the two?
Yeah, I don't want to oversimplify, but I'm going to, because I think it will help people understand.
Okay.
Public information is about media, and liaison is about agencies and stakeholders. Okay, so both are critical to responding from a communication standpoint to the outside world. It's just that public information focuses on media and the need of the general public to know what's going on from a response standpoint. Whereas the liaison operation is making sure that agencies who are not a part of the response are being kept abreast of what is going on, that their questions are being answered. It's also other key stakeholders, such as elected officials. Liaison is interfacing with them as well, making sure that they and their staff are being kept up to speed on a incident that may be taking place in their region. It's different NGOs Sierra Club, environmental organizations, it's indigenous peoples, tribes, native populations. All of these different key stakeholder groups need some kind of representation within a command post, depending on the geographical region you're operating in. And again, that's where a liaison operation picks up the ball and runs with it. Now, why do we like to co-locate a public information office and a liaison office? Because they're both about sharing critical, important information. And to have them in sync, working together side by side, will only enhance the communications output that occurs when you have all of those good minds working together, yet separately, but doing it in a way to where they're coordinated and where they share different responsibilities so that we're not duplicating functions such as information gathering. We don't need to have a liaison information gathering function and a joint information center or PIO information gathering function. We only need one. So again, we identify what are the things we only need one of, and can we make it work for both of the organizations?
Excellent. Well, what about reaching out to the rest of the command post, the rest of the response? What other kinds of coordination does the JIC and liaison need from the response?
Well, that's where the information is, and that's what we sometimes have to remind our friends over on the command on the floor who are doing all that good hard work, who are doing all the planning, who are overseeing all the operations. They kind of wonder why we're coming over and bugging them. And like I say, we have to remind them sometimes, because you're where the information is. We need it. We need to understand what's going on so we can help you get it communicated to the world. And there are different parts of the rest of the incident command structure that are just so vital to the success of a PIO or a JIC or a liaison office. And for example, within the planning section, you've got environmental specialists in the environmental unit, you've got wildlife experts, you've got people who are experts on fish, different grasses that might be jeopardized. All of those things are right there in that planning section. And of course, you have the situation unit, which is the compiler of all of the information that's been confirmed. So our folks from both the Public Information Office or JIC and from the Liaison Office, they have representatives who go out on the floor, and if they're doing their job right, they build bridges, they build a good working relationship. But again, just to our friends over in the planning section and operations section, logistics and finance, who do get us all that good information, a tip of the hat to you folks, and thanks for tolerating us. But what you guys provide us is just so critical to not just the success of the PIO and liaison functions, but to the success of the overall operation, because it allows us to tell the story of the response.
Sam, what kind of training is available to companies that want to improve their company's crisis communication program prior to going into response? What's available to them?
There's folks out there who specialize in crisis communications and training. I happens to be one of my areas of expertise, and I've been doing it for can I say it this way? Decades?
I think you can say it that way.
Yeah. But anyway, yeah, that's out there. But I got to tell you, Dan, here's where it starts. Because I've been contacted in the past by companies who say, "Oh, we want to build a crisis communications capability. We need crisis communications. Can you come and train us?" Well, I'll tell you what. If they want to develop that capability, and the request is coming from mid-level management, and upper management has no clue about it, it's not going to work. It will not work if it's only being sold from the mid-level management standpoint. Building a successful crisis communications capability has to be an overall part of the crisis management focus of executive management. So it's got to fit into that piece of the puzzle. So what does that mean? It means they need to buy into it. They need to understand the kind of training that's going to take place. They need to understand the policies that people are going to be trained to. And they have to sign off on those policies. It's one thing to say, we're going to be here as long as it takes, if that's the policy of executive management. But if it's not their policy, and in mid-level management, we've been training people to say, we're going to be here as long as it takes, we're going to be here until the agencies say the job is done. And then to have management step in and say, no, we're going to be done next week. All I'm saying is you can't have those kinds of conflicts in your messaging. And you can't have the rug pulled out from underneath you when the rubber hits the road and something real is happening. So again, it's just vital that executive management, senior management, and mid-level management are all in sync as you put together your crisis communications capability. And that means all people at all levels should have some of the training, maybe at different focuses in the training, but all should go through some sort of training so that they understand what it is you're going to be providing if and when you become the center of the target.
Sam, do you have any last pieces of advice before we close out for today?
Yeah, I would just say that it's very important, and I may have mentioned this earlier, but you just gotta be accessible. You can't put walls in front of people. You can't build a fortress around your response, because if that's the perception, day one may not be that bad, but you're going to hate day 2 and 3 if they believe that you're stonewalling information. So what I've found is reporters and impacted residents, they'll tolerate something on day 1 if they're getting some attention, if people are reaching back out to them. But if they start seeing roadblocks in front of them, that's when the anger sets in. And so again, I can't overemphasize, be accessible, be timely, get good information out as quickly as possible. And also be informative. Get information that they can use, or information that's of interest to them. I always love the number. We collected 14,000 gallons of oily water today. What the heck is oily water? Now, what happens is that number sometimes becomes 14,000 gallons of oil. Now we have problems. So again, I'm a very big stickler on let's release information that means something. Let's get it out in a timely manner. And let's also look out for people who are looking to us because they have serious issues and concerns, and they're just caught like a deer caught in the headlights. They don't know what to do. If we can pull all that together and build our organization around that, again, it's never pretty, but you're going to find that in the end, you're going to have an effective operation that will be judged as successful at the end. And some people say, well, give me an example of who ultimately was judged successful at the end. Some may argue with me on this, but I'll say right now, BP, after Macondo, was judged. You go back to the Gulf now, talk to people about how BP came through. Talk to people about Deepwater Horizon 10 years ago. Some people don't even remember it. Some people talk about how they benefited from the different programs that BP presented and put together that still are there on the Gulf, helping environmental research, helping communities that had serious tourism impacts as a result of the Gulf spill, but also as a result of Katrina. So again, I really look at BP and the commitment they made and where they are now compared to where they were 10 years ago. And I'll tell you one thing, I would hate to be the next company that spilled oil in the Gulf the size of a Deepwater Horizon spill, because they're going to be held to the standard that BP set back in 2010 and 2011.
Yeah, that's a pretty high bar to, and it almost led to their ruin, but they're back. Their stock is up. They're looking great.
They're back. Yes.
Well, Sam Sacco from Strategy Communications, thanks so much for taking the time to come on the program and share your experience with us.
Dan, it was a pleasure talking with you, and you know how much respect I have for you and your knowledge and understanding of the incident command system and the work that you've done there, and also just your ability as a teacher and an exercise drill leader. So again, always a pleasure working with you.
Thank you, Sam.
Thank you for joining us for the Tactics meeting. I hope you enjoyed the episode. If you did, please help us spread the word. Send a link to a friend, make a post on Facebook, send a tweet, do whatever else people do on the internet to spread the word. You'd be doing me a great favor. Hopefully we would provide good information to your friends and colleagues. If you have an idea for a topic or you'd like to be a guest on the Tactics meeting, you can email me. My email address is dansmiley@mac.com.